All right, this is chapter 7, Inequality, Women and Femininities from Gender, Ideas, Interactions, Institutions, second edition. All right, so looking at inequality for women and femininities. So women have more freedom in gender expression than men in our culture. Women are allowed to present themselves in masculine and feminine ways. So even though women do have more freedom in gender expression, doing femininity is relatively compulsory. So where women have to perform a specific kind of femininity, one that produces individual and group disadvantages. Although women have more freedom to resist the gender binary in some ways, the expectations for men and women are different and unequal. Such as when it comes to beauty expectations, right? We expect a lot of work from women. To me, it's funny that we have tropes in the culture that talk about women taking so long to get ready. Because clearly those are tropes created by men that don't have to do that much gendered body work. If you have to spend, hours of your life tweezing, waxing, shaving, painting on makeup, gluing on eyelashes and nails, right? Buying all these clothes because you can't wear the same stuff over and over. And, kind of like the hair, all of it, it takes so much time and effort to create this kind of hyper-feminine sense of what's considered normal in the culture, especially as television and film has affected the way that we normalized a lot of those kind of hyper performances for women, right? When you turn on the TV and the newscaster looks like she's in full drag because she has, like the full, face beat to death with the hair, the whole full hair, the nails, the whole damn thing. Like she's about to perform on Broadway or something. And it just raises the bar for every woman's performance of femininity, becomes this kind of expectation of a ton of body work, right? That's supposed to go into what beauty is, for example. That's just one example, though we'll talk about a few other ones. So obviously the chapter talked about cheerleading in the last chapter as well. But in this chapter, they're talking about how by the 60s, cheerleading teams were essentially all female. And instead of being more leadership-based, they were just served as support to male athletes, right? Instead of being the equivalent of the quarterback, you're now cheering for the quarterback. So cheerleading was now just a cute sideshow to the main event. By the 90s, cheer was again masculinized and involved in intense athleticism as gymnastics were added or were back. And this involved a lot more danger and kind of athleticism that, again, as, especially colleges competed and things like this, there was more of kind of a sport relationship brought back in the 90s. So since cheerleading is now associated with the feminine, it is still seen as less serious than other physical activities. So strategies to recruit men appealed to their masculinity, like, hey, we want you to be in cheerleading, we need your strength, right? And also appeal to their sexuality. This idea of, hey, if you're a male cheerleader, you could be surrounded by beautiful, sexy women, right? So female cheerleaders wear sexy outfits that offer their bodies as spectacles for others to enjoy. A cheerleader's primary job is to root for the football or basketball team or whatever team she's cheering for. But cheerleading remains largely a feminine auxiliary to sport. Not the event itself, just the thing during, halftime. So despite the athleticism involved in cheerleading, it's classified as an activity rather than a sport in many contexts. So among all types of high schools and college sports, cheerleading accounts for 66% of injuries to female athletes and has the potential to result in permanent disability. But again, not considered a sport because we've trivialized and feminized it to the point where, it's more about being cute than anything. Though, of course, it is still like a lot of work and a lot of physical athleticism. But again, when men were doing it, they didn't have to wear little skimpy outfits, and it was considered more respected when men did it. Okay, so when it comes to gender for women, daily life is less constrained for women when it comes to gender performance than it is for men. Unlike men who face policing when they do gender associated with the feminine, women's performance of masculinity is often regarded positively, so that women are doing almost everything that men do. So parents are also more tolerant of girls' gender non-conforming behavior. Research found that parents actually encourage girls whose behaviors or activities resist the gender binary, while at the same time policing boys' gender non-conforming behavior. So while they felt a need to uncover a reason for their son's preference for feminine things, their daughter's interest in masculine things needed no such explanation. Since masculine activities are highly valued, it made perfect sense that girls would be drawn to them. So it all comes back to the hierarchy, right? So when it comes to women soldiers, this is another example in the book. Many people admire women who enter masculine occupations, not only because they're defying stereotypes, but because of the virtue of being associated with men. Those occupations have more esteem than feminine occupations. In 2016, the last occupation that was off limits to women in the US, where combat positions in the military, was opened. So the developments are all rightly interpreted as signs that women have gained more equality with men. And as measures by the scope of gender roles, women in contemporary Western societies do have more options than men in a lot of ways. While women are lower on the social hierarchy, the idea is, like, let's say, as a woman myself, if I do something masculine, then I'm just going up the hierarchy. I'm not challenging the hierarchy. But my husband, a man, if he does something feminine, he's going down the hierarchy. He's challenging the hierarchy of society. And that's why men have so much more social consequences for that. Because women, if we're acting masculine, we're not really challenging the norms of society. Okay, so when it comes to performance of femininity, presenting oneself as a sex object is one way for women who do masculinity to balance their gender performances, right? So you have the example in the book was the CrossFit competitor and weightlifter Christmas Abbott, who is going to use more femininity to balance out the relationship between having muscles and being physically agile, which we associate with masculinity, though it should just be associated with bodies, right? Meaning bodies can be strong, so therefore bodies are strong. But instead, we think of it as male bodies. Even if you are a woman and the muscles on your body are female muscles, they're still considered masculine. So again, the meanings have less to do with our actual bodies and more to do with the cultural notions of masculinity and femininity. So the feminine apologetic points to how a woman's performance of femininity can be a way to soothe others' concerns about her appropriation of masculinity. So again, that example of Abbott, who gets away with being masculine by also conveying feminineness and sexual attractiveness. So she's like a lot of other women in the West today, which is that she's allowed to do what she wants as long as she sends clear signals that she wants men's approval. So once again, we have to take that intersectionality into consideration. Abbott has an advantage in this effort. She was born blonde into a society that privileges whiteness, with features that are considered conventionally pretty. It's easier for her to do the feminine apologetic than it is for women who aren't at ease with their femininity or who weren't granted as much femininity to start with. So like Christmas Abbott, the character of Wonder Woman, played by Gal Gadot in the 2017 feature film, is both sexy and strong. Having a male love interest affirms that she's still feminine enough to fall in love. So Wonder Woman provides a good example of the feminine apologetic. She's strong, capable, and skilled in battle, but also sexy, sweet, and both attractive to and attracted by a man she loves. So some women are ascribed masculinity by American culture because of racism. So women, like queer and black women, do not have the same options for mixing in masculinity. Instead, they may be forced to perform a feminine apologetic. So associations of femininity are based in whiteness. Femininity is not so subtly white, right? So being light-skinned, having long, straight hair is associated with femininity. So black women's hair with curly or kinky dark hair may have to decide whether to leave it natural, to wear wigs, or to try to force their hair to resemble a white aesthetic. So black women can choose to wear their hair in ways that reflect their own personal values and style, but they have to contend with the ways that other people respond to them. The label of the angry black woman is something that black women are constantly trying to avoid because it's just a stigma that comes from the culture being placed upon women based on oftentimes their bodies, not even what they're doing. So regardless of personal preferences, both, the book talks about how like Beyonce and Solange make strategic decisions about what to do with their hair, knowing that others were going to evaluate them based on their choices. So even with that much power and wealth and cultural capital, for black women in America, hairstyles are more than personal. They're political. So black women's hair has become the subject of decades of lawsuits, especially because a lot of employment And a lot of really, workplace issues come down to this idea of being professional, and what's considered professional as being white. And so it's not subtly racist, right? It's just, again, a different social hierarchy, in this case, white supremacy, trying to place itself upon women's experiences and performances of their own gender identities. So this is where intersectionality is important as well, because we can't talk about women as if they're a monolithic group, or men as if they're a monolithic group, right? The intersections, those identities, being queer, being a person of color, being an immigrant, being any of these kind of other intersecting identities, can greatly affect the kind of gender strategies and gender opportunities that you have in the culture and how people see and interpret you. So when you refuse or fail to perform, right, sometimes women are going to refuse or just fail to perform enough conventional femininity to soothe the concerns of the other people around them. So that just really means there's wrong ways to be a woman, or what we call pariah femininities. So these are ways of being a woman that, by directly challenging male dominance, are widely and aggressively policed. Women who perform pariah femininities don't defer to men. They don't care if men find them attractive. They don't have or withhold sex for concern of whether or not men approve of them, right? They don't form households with men. They just do their own damn thing. And so there is also a price to that defiance, right? Women who defy rather than balance, refuse, that femininity performance that's kind of pushed upon all women, again, that femininity performance that's expected is one that complements hegemonic masculinity. So as a result, a pariah femininity cannot do conventional femininity, right? Because these femininities are described as a pariah because they're stigmatizing the women who adopt them or ascribe to them. So if you choose that identity, it can be really fun because defiance is a thrill, honestly. It can be really nice to just be like, screw you, I'm not going to do what you tell me. And I live for myself and not for your evaluations of my body. Like that's fun, right? But again, doing so puts women at risk of serious repercussions, right? So femininity itself is very disempowering. And the punishments for women who embody pariah femininities reveal that opportunities to balance masculinity and femininity might not be as easy as they like. Some behaviors cross an invisible line, and to do them is to risk rejection, verbal attack, violence, and even ostracism. Women must do enough femininity and the right kind given their subcultural environment and mix of identities. In addition to women being expected to perform femininity and do specific amounts and kinds of difference from men, they're required to do inferiority to men. And this is because femininity is very disempowering, right? You're supposed to defer to men. So, this idea of doing more, winning less, just whatever personality traits, styles, activities, and roles are deemed feminine are going to be subject to 3 relations of gender inequality. Those ones we talked about before. Sexism, Androcentrism, and Subordination. Because of enduring sexism, a woman's mere femaleness is always a source of prejudice. This means from whatever women do, they have to do it better than men if they want to be evaluated as equally good. All other things being equal, a woman can be as good as a man, as smart, as creative, as talented, as hardworking, as strong, as devoted, as diligent, as accomplished, and she can still be evaluated lower. Even when she does more, when she outperforms her male counterparts, she's still likely to win less. So women's roles are seen as less important under a system of androcentrism. Because femininity is disparaged, the gender rules require a feminine apologetic. And this requires women to perform roles that are seen as less important. So many traits associated with femininity are actively disparaged in our culture. For example, the feminized task of raising children. I mean, people have kids. This is like a normative thing. But that's seen as, oh, that woman's boring. She's unambitious. She had children. Like, you mean the reason that you exist? Because your parents did it? That's boring? Right? It's such a bizarre thing that, like, we expect women to bear children. We expect all of this from them. And if they don't do it, we're like, when are you going to have kids? 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 And if they do it, we're like, oh, she's boring. She's just having a family. So it's like, it's a lose-lose situation in a lot of situations when it comes to the ways in which the cultural norms affect our opportunities to perform our gender identities in a way that give us some sort of satisfaction. So sometimes androcentric disparagement of people who do femininity is shrouded in what seems like a compliment. And that's even worse, right? That kind of like reverse compliment. Like where oftentimes, we have a culture that doesn't offer real childcare options, doesn't have paid family leave, doesn't have support for workers with families, like such as daycare on site at their jobs, like it's very common within European societies. So we put so much more pressure on families in America, and since the gender division of the family, the idea is that if you're in a heterosexual couple that has children, then the assumption is that the woman is going to be the one doing the child rearing, the extra work that's required in feeding, cleaning, and providing for that family. Whether it's, the kind of emotional labor that's expected of like, when the kid's crying or soothing them in different ways. And then we make that into something less than or negative, even though like properly acculturating a child to society is kind of like a big deal. And it has like a large social consequences if you're not able to do it very well. But yeah, we make it like very petty, which is bizarre in a culture that pretends that it's very family oriented or family friendly, to not even give people a couple weeks to let like their insides heal after they just pushed a bowling ball out of their body. Most daycares won't even take a baby until they're like 8 weeks old. So if your company offers less than 8 weeks of paid family leave, which most of them don't offer much of anything, there's no national paid family leave at all. We're the only country like this, at least in like the developed world, in the same way in like similarly incomed countries. I mean, look at our neighbors. Like Canada has a pretty long leave. I mean, even Mexico has 12 weeks paid maternity leave, but we have 0 here. So that puts a lot of a strain on the family. And if the expectations of family life are more put on women than men, more of that kind of expectation or that compounding problem falls on women's shoulders. So there's also different kinds of sexism they talk about in the book: benevolent sexism and hostile sexism. So benevolent sexism is the attribution of positive traits to women that nonetheless justify women's subordination to men. So benevolent sexism is making women more dependent on men by virtue of positive characteristics attributed to femininity, which positions women as inferior. So let me give you an example. Benevolent sexism, the idea that we have to protect women because they're just weak, those poor little things. Right? You see this as a logic. We'll talk later about bathroom bills in like a future chapter, but this is often used as the logic in those kind of situations. Like, we need to protect the women, we need to protect the children. Or we have this idea when it came to one of the kind of weird logics of why, or at least, again, not a logic, but a false justification of why we invaded Afghanistan. Part of what was lauded at the time was, we're going to liberate women. We're going to help women. We're going to end sexism because all these poor women, they need our help. And so it's this weird benevolent sexism, this idea that women are powerless themselves and they need male help and protection, that, again, it's still sexist. It's not as bad in a way as hostile sexism, in a way, right? It still sucks. But hostile sexism is harassment, threats, and often violence to enforce women's subservience to men. So hostile sexism obviously is worse to experience in that way, but benevolent sexism happens every single damn day and kind of makes its way into a lot of like the microaggressions that people experience. And often benevolent sexism blooms into hostile sexism pretty quickly, right? So, for example, you're walking down the street and you get catcalled, hey, you so-and-so, blah, blah, they're saying stuff about your body, and then they're like, hey, you should smile, what's your name, blah, blah. And then when you say, no, thank you, not interested, or you just don't return the harassment, it turns to, well, I don't like you anyway, you're a bitch, and like threats of violence. So, benevolent sexism becomes hostile sexism often in interactions where men have tested women to act a certain way, in a certain expected way. And when women just say, nope, not doing it, it often blooms into that hostile sexism. So, again, sometimes those androcentric disparagements that we hear of people who do femininity is really shrouded in what sounds like a compliment, which again is an example of benevolent sexism. So benevolent sexism can seem like female-friendly gender order, but that's not how it works. When women don't subordinate themselves to men, it can feel to some men like an assault on their rights, and that leads to hostile sexism. So the benevolent nature is flipped, showing the other side of the same coin. So when it comes to requirements to be subordinated, because power is gendered, the requirement to do femininity is also the requirement to do subordination. So part of this means helping others. Women are, it's believed by these weird biological arguments that women are better suited than men to forego their leisure time, to forego their education or their career aspirations in order to help other people, whether this be their family members, people in their community, their own friends, etc. Helping others is a big part of the expectation for women, especially when it comes to the more patriarchal the culture, the more the expectation on women to be that nature of the family. So when you look at icons of femininity, they're often supportive and not leading roles. So mother, wife, nurse, secretary, teacher, these are supportive roles, often not leading roles, ones that leave women less intellectually developed, less accomplished, and less impressive than men. But these are the roles that we often try to push women into. So subordination is never bothering others with one's own discomfort or concerns. So you put other people first, even when it's difficult or dangerous to do so. That's the very definition of subordination. So it's really all about power. To do femininity is to do deference. And to do deference is to do femininity. So there's language of subordination as well. So if you're expected to defer at all times, this can affect the way that you speak. Meaning, hedging. Things like, I'd kind of, or it seems like. So when a woman says something like, you're wrong, it's like, whoa, wow, what a horrible thing she's done. What a pariah of femininity. She stood up for herself. She was concrete. If a man does the same thing, it's like, so what? He was just being assertive. But assertive for women means bitch, right? It's very different. For men, it's just considered like, no, he was just being assertive, right? There's not the same connotation. So women are trained. They learn to say things like, well, I kind of think that might not be the best idea, instead of saying, that's a bad idea, right? Because saying that's a bad idea is a challenge to masculinity. And this idea of masculinity is always being the top of the pecking order, always being in a hierarchy. So if someone challenges you, then there's this idea to push back, to challenge back. Versus women, they gain power through consensus. So it's more about hedging people to your idea or your perspective. So trying to kind of meet them where they are and say, well, I understand why you think that, but here's what I think might be a better way, right? Instead of just saying you're wrong, do this instead. So I kind of, or it seems like, is an example of hedging, which women often do linguistically without even realizing it. We've just all been trained to do this, right? Largely because the patterns of language are established when we're children, and a lot of us grow up in situations where we have very gendered play as children, right? Where we're very gender segregated, the other kids have cooties or that kind of thing. And so as a result, we develop these kind of weird linguistic patterns in childhood. So another one is hyperpoliteness, oh, if you don't mind, right? How many times have you heard that? If you don't mind, or, oh, I'd really appreciate that. Instead of just the kind of expectation of someone doing something for you because you asked, right? Some women feel the need to, fall over backwards, thanking and praising, to kind of make up for the assumed slight of asking for help in any way. And there's often this situation when it comes to language of using questions in response to questions. So, in response to being asked when you want to eat dinner, you'd say something like, oh, how does 7 sound? Instead of saying I want to eat it this time, that's what we're doing, right? So it's not overt. A lot of this stuff is subconscious. A lot of this stuff is subtle, and it makes its way through our interactions. So it kind of cements inside of us, as the institutions promote certain ideas, that affects the kind of language and opportunities we have, and then that structures the interactions that we have that form our identities. So while we associate this type of language with women, it also often happens that it's not just about women, it's about people in a weak relationship with others. If you feel lower on the social hierarchy, you're going to use more of this couching language, especially when it comes to like your boss or, right, someone in a hierarchy of that nature. That oftentimes it's almost like in the animal kingdom, like showing your belly to say you're not a threat and trying to kind of, reinforce that hierarchy or show that you know your position, you know your place, right, when asking others for something. So when women refuse to do subordination by offering a pleasant countenance for men or deferring to male authority, they stray into pariah territory. And so aggrieved entitlement is anger about something that men believe that they own or deserve and is being unjustly taken or withheld from them. So we see this in regards to like all sorts of stupid stuff these days, like Ghostbusters. I'm sorry, that's just one example, but this idea that like, you ruined my childhood because now there's a female Ghostbusters. Well, then just like don't watch it if you don't want to watch it, right? And you're going to miss all the cameos from the original guys in it. But anyway, this aggrieved entitlement, like it's mine. That's not for them, it's for us. It really motivates a lot of the problems, especially on the internet, when it comes to like Gamergate and this idea of like who plays video games. Well, historically, women have always been over 40% of people playing video games. It's not new that women started playing video games. It's just that if there's a male control of the industry when it comes to who designs the games, who programs them, all these fun things, it does affect the representations within the games themselves. But anyway, it's this weird notion of aggrieved entitlement really has a big power in our culture, saying like, this is mine and you can't take it. And this really kind of affects the relationship between, women just standing up for their rights and why people get so incredibly angrily violent when that happens. So part of this is also misogyny, or men's fear and hatred of women with power, right? That you see women that have a lot of power in the culture are often incredibly denigrated, called horrible things. I mean, there's this great example of when Hillary, I'm trying to remember which time she was running. It might have been 2008. Yeah, I think so. Because I think it was when she was on the campaign trail against Barack Obama in the Democratic primary. And she was followed around to all of her campaign stops by these men that were screaming, "Iron my shirt." They would just chant, "Iron my shirt, iron my shirt," over and over, as like a, sideshow, I guess, to her like campaign event stuff is one example of this, where this idea of a woman gaining power, what were they trying to say by "iron my shirt"? They're trying to say, like, it doesn't matter if you are, a lawyer, a senator, have much more education than those dudes chanting, have much more experience, especially leadership experience. But no, what matters is you're a woman, and historically that means you iron my shirt. So, trying to reinforce the gender binary in a very overt way by screaming "iron my shirt" over and over, which is funny because she doesn't iron shirts. Like, she's got people to do that. She's crazy rich. But anyway, it's still it's one example of like many examples I could throw at you, but you probably don't want to hear this all day. But of just how the kind of societal notions make their way into, especially politics. Ugh, when it comes to politics, it's extremely gendered, right? But misogyny is a large, unfortunate feature of our modern day society. And so trans women are particularly vulnerable to this. They're estimated to be 4 times more likely than any other woman to be killed. So whether or not women strike a balance that pleases others, both doing and not doing femininity, can be dangerous. When aggrieved entitlement leads to murder, the crime can be described as misogynistic murder. Misogynistic murder is the killing of women by men who are motivated to punish women for attempting to exercise that power. So the problem, too, is that these murders are disturbingly common. So the book provided several examples of men committing violence motivated by an aggrieved entitlement to women. And this stems from a belief that females and femininity are subordinate to men and masculinity, so these men use the violence to try to reassert that social hierarchy. So self-harm is also an issue for women, right? When women set out to manage the violence they expect or experience from men, they sometimes engage in self-harm or victim blaming. So victim blaming, it's not just done by others to women, it's often done by women to each other and women to themselves. right? They blame themselves for the violence they suffer and often offer excuses for the men as to why they did the violence they were doing. And again, other women also blame victims. On college campuses, women sometimes accuse sexual assault victims of being naive or stupid. For many women, imagining that the target must have done something wrong or stupid gives them a false sense of security, right? Oh, I'm not that stupid. I would be different. No, you wouldn't. Nope. You would also drink at a party. You would also go home with someone that you trusted that you then found out you couldn't trust, right? But it requires women to restrict their lives in the hopes of staying safe, and no one wants to do that. So it's easier to just say, oh, she was a liar, or she wasn't a real victim, so then I don't have to worry about me being a victim. So a woman's style of dress, how drunk she gets, whether she trusts a man who ultimately harms her, does not make her responsible for the violence or the harm she experiences. Like, obviously, right? Why do some people have such a tendency to blame the victim? It goes back to that thing I was saying before about whenever there's an inequality in society, we have ideologies to justify it. Victim blaming is another one of those, right? Because if it's the victim's fault, then we don't have to change anything. We don't have to address any problems about the fact that we might have men that we know that are rapists, or men that often cross a line with women, but we see redeeming qualities in them in other ways, so therefore we don't want to confront this one toxic thing that they're doing that's incredibly harmful. Right, especially in like fraternal cultures, like, when you look at anything that involves that kind of manly brotherhood stuff, right? Whether it's frats on campus, they're more likely going to kind of join in lockstep with each other than to really dissent when they think that there's issues of like sexual assault happening. So we just blame the victim instead. We just say, well, she had too many drinks, or she's a liar, she doesn't know what she's talking about, etc., etc., etc. Because then we don't have to actually address the problem, right? When ultimately, should people be able to like drink at a party? Yes, right? So think about it in a different way. What if instead of being sexually assaulted, you swapped in being stabbed, right? Or being shot as a different alternative, right? Like, well, she shouldn't have gone to that party if she didn't want to get stabbed or shot, right? Or, well, she had 2 drinks. What does she expect? She's not going to get stabbed or shot. Right? Like, we wouldn't justify someone being shot just because they were wearing a short dress. Right? But that's like what you wear to a party. This isn't a new thing, but it's new that younger generations are buying less into victim blaming and starting to realize like sex positivity and not reducing people to these weird rape myths is actually a positive thing. Okay, so women are powerful, right? But they often don't recognize their power, or they resist using that power. So how girls and women manage risks of violence varies, but the collective challenge women face is finding a way to fight misogyny. Conventional femininity offers only one choice, between victim or pariah. So women find it difficult to claim a strategy of self-assertion that's effective, feels good, but is also tolerated by the people around them. Part of women's struggle to redefine femininity is overcoming an inability to imagine that they're loud, strong, angry, or dangerous. For example, resistance to boys being gentle and girls yelling and hollering is being combated in Sweden, where kindergarten teachers are teaching boys how to give massages and girls are being told how to throw open the window and scream. Which I feel like, ooh, these days, I feel like everybody's just got to throw open the window and scream once in a while. Oh, sounds like my neighbor's kid's doing that right now. Okay, so just ignore the screaming in the background. Thanks. Okay, that was actually really good timing for the lecture. So anyway, bargaining with patriarchy. Patriarchal bargains. So women also, like men, make patriarchal bargains to maximize their autonomy, their safety, and their well-being in the face of sexism, androcentrism, and subordination. So one bargain involves trading power for protection and support of a man. This bargain involves performing emphasized femininity, an exaggerated form of conventional femininity that's oriented on accommodating the interests and desires of men. With this strategy, a woman attempts to perfect this performance of femininity in exchange for the support of a man who will share his privilege with her. So another way to understand this too is emphatic sameness. This is the position of those who perform emphasized femininity is that it's always precarious. They can't control how much reward men offer and on what terms. So women with ambitions to enter male-dominated professions may make a patriarchal bargain that involves being one of the guys. a strategy that sociologist Michael Kimmel refers to as emphatic sameness. Like, I'm just like you guys. I'm one of the guys, right? Which is kind of, I guess when I'm really thinking about it, has been my strategy for a long time as a gender strategy, which also accounts for my drinking tolerance, because that was one of my ways, was to like be like, oh, I'm one of the boys, I can drink you under the table, right? And by embracing those kind of androcentrisms, they hope to avoid both the benevolent and the hostile sexism. So many women do emphatic sameness, which again involves downplaying femininity in themselves in exchange for the right to do some masculinity. Doing emphatic sameness is a way for some women to gain power as individuals in a society that values masculinity. So this strategy is only possible in specific kinds of masculinized contexts where men tolerate the presence of women who are successful in the performance of masculinity. Emphatic sameness is a bad bargain because it involves the denigration of femininity. The majority of women who adopt emphatic sameness reject femininity but are still female, right? So this bargain reinforces the idea that women and anything feminine are less valuable. So emphatic sameness undermines the empowerment of women as a group, even if it allows an individual woman to have more power. So most women don't do either emphasized femininity or emphatic sameness consistently. Instead, they may apply different strategies based on the context, right? Because the bargains have limits. So women may use emphasized femininity or emphatic sameness strategically as part of the patriarchal bargain, but it also undermines their empowerment as a social group in society. So the double bind. This is a situation in which cultural expectations are contradictory. So making success is very unattainable, right? Because you can't be powerful because then you fail as a woman. But if you succeed as a woman, you have to give up power, right? So this is true for women in Western societies, that being too powerful is a problem, but also not having any power is a problem too. So, doing too much or too little, there's a lot of examples in the book of women whose biological sex was called into question due to their athletic performance. So the double bind makes it so these women have to present themselves as feminine to counter the questions about their biology. Why? Because they succeed in some sort of masculine pursuit. So when looking at the big picture, feminism is the belief that all people should have equal rights and opportunities regardless of their gender. While feminism is concerned with gender inequality, intersectionality has also become central to the conversation. As we've talked about before, the importance of understanding the ways in which all of our different social identities intersect and create a social life for us is integral, right? But oftentimes, especially in a class like this, we have to focus on gender as the main paradigm or social identity in which we're studying, but we have to understand how those intersections impact people's lived experiences and opportunities. So today, many feminists target the matrix of domination. This is a structure in which multiple hierarchies intersect to create a pyramid of privilege, leaving on top those people who are advantaged in every hierarchy, right? So if we have a hierarchy by gender, where cisgender men are on top, if we have a hierarchy by sexual orientation, where heterosexuals are on top, we have a hierarchy of disability, where able-bodied people are on top, right? We have a hierarchy of race ethnicity where white people are at top. So if you're at the top of each one of those identities, then you're closer to the top of that pyramid of the matrix of domination, and you experience privilege along every level of those identities. But for most of us, there's always going to be some intersection, like maybe your social class isn't great. So that puts you farther down the hierarchy. And so the matrix of domination just talks about how we often have multiple identities and multiple intersections, and that those leave us with a different kind of social position in this world, depending on where those intersect. So therefore, when someone defines themselves as a feminist today, they often mean that they're part of a network of activists that are targeting a range of injustices. So this new gender order hurts men and women, but in different ways. Men suffer more as individuals, while women are harmed more as a group. Men are harmed as individuals because hegemonic masculinity pushes them to obey its imperatives. Women as a group pay more for the cost of hierarchical gender binary, measured by the economic vulnerability and physical dangers that they face. So as a result, women are more likely to name and resist the unfairness of these costs.